Chum de Jabe Yon La Jaza Lo Kunde Lo De Dentranye Dranam Tarabsrave Chinye Dungun Jin Zishre Nije Tugra Levonze Kunde Sebe Zunr Mare Mundum Dungue Chizeve Razo Kona Buji Tarze Yin La Juju Yon Den Song Rodrai Chero Nilon Leje Chadron Dronze Shin Mare Mizre Dumre Nyugu Chinye Janza Rajanam Dene Tajen Saju Darzen Yenden Luzo Jase Tuyeku Tundrai Judan Chunye Jende Daglu Mizre Jambe Yon La Zedine Cheje Chenro Sraje Dade de Mohamed Barab Salane Kadan Denje Jonloi Dobaye Loje Pobe Noa Zardo Solo Tamgedu Je Shajer Zuzhon Jenje Medu Duje Bonjamba Serge Lumbo Dabra Jibe Gui Shaje Jebe Shavla Ingu Shai Chal Xie Kalla Chen Rabbi Chen Gura Jen Zebe Don Duje Len Lapo Yarbe Tenbai Gunne Sanzebe Kaju Rinpoche Chela Shaje Sarab Gundo Sije Tanye Le Tamge Salmu Shage Yong Zongshin Shanchum Yinbe Longken Karma Ba Meshe Debe Chiwe Zuge Du Senden Poran Jebe Ne Shodo Jemi Tukje Sole Magendo Pomorin Je Yon Jen Denma Yayam Drema Choge Shiba Ezol Lasso Tene Tam Number Sangma Chusingin Che Tene Chosum La Japsum Rove Semtang Songjub the Semjebe Jepa Ni Saltabro Nang.
So please begin by taking refuge in the three jewels, also known as the three rare and supreme ones, and then go on to generate the Bodhi mind, which is to be your motivation for attentively listen to and later on contemplate the explanations that are to be given.
Teachede Tatare Chödrak Kama Shubiyorsana Jasela Lin Sodema Seven Tinjun Dema Shubiyore.
So the topic is that of the 37 practices of a Bodhisattva.
Tatela Tomara Gewa Pardu Gewa Tar Gewate number sum Yedevare.
And regarding this topic, the practices of a Bodhisattva, it is explained that those practices are virtuous actions at the beginning of the path of a Bodhisattva, throughout the path of a Bodhisattva, and at the end of it. And when one speaks, of course, of at the end of the path of the Bodhisattva, it's not a matter of an end where one speaks of an end because of now terminating that path. It's rather having end here is synonymous with having actualized the various goals set out while practicing the path in question, and thus having achieved the goal, and therefore of course, continuing, but as a fully trained bodhisattva, someone who has achieved the goal and who therefore is able to benefit beings on a very vast scale.
Lasso, ta te che de nganzo tomar gewate ta hyutsar.
Now, in terms of these three segments, beginning, middle, and end, as it were, we've gone through the practices that are associated with the beginning segment. And today we'll start with the second segment, the middle segment, which is a reference to the path of a bodhisattva in its various stages.
Bar Yongdun Tomar Gawa Ledon la Sholoka Nirova.
Oh, so sorry, yes. Well, if we take, I should add this in order to make clear what was just said. Of course, we're talking about the path of a bodhisattva in general, but here in the specific context of the text called What a Bodhisattva Does, 37 Practices, authored by Ngulchu Togme. And in terms of the various segments of this text, the text begins with an introductory part made up of 2 verses, where the author begins by paying homage to the Supreme Teacher and to Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Thereafter, he sets out in the next verse his pledge for, or his pledge in terms of, explaining what the practices of a bodhisattva are. So that's in terms of beginning, middle, and end, the beginning segment of this particular text. Then you have the middle, which is the actual topic, the 37 practices. So that segment spans over the 37 practices listed in the text. And we've come to the 11th of these 37 practices. And point made is that all segments, beginning, middle, and end, embody virtue, a path of virtue. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Lasso, Tene, Parted Gawa Yongdun Tela, Sanchu Simche Yu, Sanchu Simche Ngu, Teacher Pajungsul the Sum Yurt.
Now, this segment, which spans over the 37 practices set forth in 37 verses, can be divided into 3 subsections. The segment which sets forth the causes for, or the causes that make the generating of the body-mind possible. Then you have the second subsection here, which is about the path or those practices themselves. And then you have the third subsegment, where the author explains the training necessary in order to achieve the goals of this path. So in the previous sessions, the first sub-segment has been explained, the segment in terms of the 37 practices, which is about the practices that make it possible for a practitioner to generate the body-mind. So the practices which cause the generating of the body-mind or the arising of the body-mind. So today we'll start with the second of the three subsections of this part of the text, which deals with the actual topic, that of the practices of a bodhisattva, or simply what a bodhisattva does. How does a bodhisattva behave simply? How can you recognize someone by way of their behavior here in the context of a bodhisattva? Now, as always, the main theme, as it were, is the body-mind, and it has two perspectives, relative and absolute. Det sunger va? Kepa dan kene laptsulni sungen då. Da kepa da ketsarva segorva kan resena kepe gyu kanga rotsarva.
Jun rone ta jude chongdu 당에 산제의 성적 선바 탐지의 통네 semjing 던 두비스 탐제들 링기 어려 될게 빠세.
So here, or this subsection begins with the generating of the body-mind for the first time. As well as the different practices the practicing bodhisattva trains in once he's been able to generate the body-mind. As was just explained during the previous verses, the actions that make the arising of the body-mind possible have been explained. So the person who has chosen to practice these paths begins by those. Once he's gone through those, he should be able to truly generate the body-mind, which is very often known as the ceremony of taking the Bodhisattva vows. Now, that ceremony should happen in consequence of having gone through the previous preparatory stages, as it were, explained in the first 10 verses. Then, as the practitioner would now be able to give rise to the body mind, truly generate the body mind within. The author next explains what that involves and what the practitioner then does in terms of his training on this path of a bodhisattva. And of course, that relates to the first of the two perspectives of the body mind, relative body mind.
다티 제용도 당한테 가장 쇼로가 주바데 가르쳐야 되버스나 다 산제 세다제 법봉버 주네 녜심진지 던 쪽기인은 담자와들이
주베 kapsel.
야 쇼로가 주베 kapsel.
디 주바데 오르 에프타데
셈지 뇌 들어와.
셈충의 주바네 고속인도.
주바 드랑지.
Oh dear.
주진네.
주직데 송송.
주진네 제발 럽줄 들어와.
Sorry. It was a bit unclear to me. However,
주지 인사로 또
they do dikasang 송송.
Oh yeah.
It appears that you have to correct your notes if you're taking notes. It's always a good idea to do so, if I may suggest that. This segment, which starts, or sub-segment, which starts with the generating of the body mind, starts with the previous verse, number 10, which was explained during the previous session.
Yes.
Yes, Khenpo Rinpoche has just checked with the commentary he uses as a basis for his explanations, and that's where the generating of the body mind begins. Then from verse or practice number 11, it's about how a bodhisattva trains in order to make for a change where he progressively, to a higher and higher extent or degree, becomes a bodhisattva, simply.
다티 제용도 다 내성줍초도 셈지 사라져. 다지 산네 셈지를 내합 고고여와.
So once the practitioner has committed to the path of the body mind, or the path of a bodhisattva, however one wants to phrase it, he has pledged to uphold the commitments of this path, which spells the beginning of practicing this path. So next, evidently, he would engage in the various kind of actions and the type of behavior which will make for that kind of change, so that he truly, to a higher and higher degree, as he makes progress, comes closer and closer, or approaches, as it were, the goal of the path.
Ja, da Shangju Semje Semje da Lab Yong Tu Nyamja tu Chödrak Lab Bitsu Dang Yetup Chiche Pachong Sul Ni Yue Bate.
And in terms of training, you have two parts. One, well, usually these two parts are known as meditation and post-meditation. However, the Tibetan word for what is translated as meditation would translate to, in the context of a beginner, cultivating a state of equanimity, a balanced state or mindset. And number two, post-meditation, usually known as post-meditation, is about the various actions of a proper bodhisattva. What one does when focusing on benefiting others in terms of one's many relationships with others. How do I behave there as a proper practitioner of the path of a bodhisattva? And how do I train myself so that in terms of behavior I can make the kind of progress required, namely how I interact with others, so that my interactions with others accord with the principles of the path of a bodhisattva.
Lasso, Tene, teaching the time Nyamja la Lab Yong Tu, then Nyamja Gabla, Dargin, Nyambatang, Dargin, Jeve Semni la Lab Nong Koyot.
So, in terms of meditation, which the word meaning translated into English would be resting in a balanced state, or resting in a state of equanimity, as it were. However, the word equanimity here, it's not just a reference to resting in a state free from thoughts that concern the world, for example. It's not equanimous in the state of, in the sense of relaxing and that sort of idea, which is very common today. It's about a contemplative type of meditation, where one looks at various perspectives in the context of one's relationships with all sentient beings, particular in terms of how one views others. And the goal here is to view the welfare of others, or rather to look at their situation in comparison to one's own, and when there are imbalances in terms of my situation being much better than theirs, it's about, to begin with, wanting a mindset which wants to change that, so that the welfare of others is as important to me as my own welfare, to the extent where I, in the end, make no distinction between myself and others in terms of wanting more for myself and less for others. It's rather about the reversed order here, that one wants more for others and less for oneself. So it's a matter of not being selfish at all, where others are as important to oneself as one's own person. There is a balance here, as it were, in terms of how one views others when comparing them, or in relation with, or in relation to oneself. Selfishness, as it were, to put it simply, is counteracted. That's the purpose of the contemplative type of meditation one begins with here. And that is then to be followed by efforts where one, to some degree, exchanges one's own good circumstances for the difficult circumstances of others. One actively goes out there and tries to change a bad situation for one or many individuals, which may have the consequence of worsening one's own, as it were, but this is something one accepts, this is something one wants to do.
Tā tī chē yōng tū, tā ñam yāg tsū tē, sholo ka chū chik pānda ka tēngi yō rē.
Ñam shaki kare?
Ñam yāg tsū tē, dāg yīn, ñam pātā yewe tsū tē.
And these two types of training are explained in verse number 11.
Tan din de re la, pen na thangpo ngā tsō chōngchū sem tē, la labong tū, ngā tsō la dak yin ñam bē sem chi mē ba la, dak yin yewe sem sengi tē yōng tam mē rē.
You see, the point of the order of these two, to first achieve a mindset where others are seen as important as one's own person. There are no imbalances here. Without that mindset being generated to at least some degree, you're not really truly able to benefit anyone. Because your mind will be tainted by the worldly mindset that consciously or subconsciously values your own welfare more than the welfare of others. Therefore, you can't really benefit anyone. So, the first of these two, explained in brief, is the very basis for the path of the Bodhisattva, the very basis of the Bodhi mind. Without counteracting selfish motives, one is never really able to truly benefit others. And this is here so-called contemplative meditation. It's not about focusing on just one object of meditation in order with the aim of pacifying perturbation, for example, within. it's not about meditating on emptiness. It's not about meditating on a yidam. It's not about that type of meditation, or those types of meditation rather. Here we're talking about contemplative meditation, where one uses the regular thought process in order to improve its quality, as it were. The aim, as was said, is to counteract selfish concerns. I suppose one would refer to this type of meditation as, in English, as contemplative meditation. So, in terms of the two types, or the two kinds of contemplative meditation here, in terms of the focus, the first is that of educating oneself mentally with the goal of seeing the welfare of others as important as one's own welfare. And the text regarding this part of the contemplative meditation says the following: without exception, all suffering comes of wanting happiness for yourself. Perfect Buddhas, on the other hand, are born from wanting to benefit others. So it's a matter of the focus the mindset in question takes. The worldly mindset takes, or the not yet trained mindset of a practicing bodhisattva takes the focus of wanting happiness for yourself, whereas the mindset of perfect Buddhas takes the focus of wanting to benefit others. So selfish motives are there not at hand. That's the difference.
Perna tanjiktin di nangla tene nyokta yusete dagjin manyam besem tene yongdo songare.
All problems in the world originate with selfish motives. That one's concern for oneself is greater than one's concern for the welfare of others. That's just a fact. And this is the very root of all problems. This imbalanced mindset where I am the main person and the rest are not as important.
Yakab chigna nyoktayenendra, mirik chig nyoktayenendra, tene ta ti yusek zawad kar rendo tetan, nga lawachi yin sambe samar tongshu. Tene shongre.
Just think about simple situations, such as a couple who quarrel with one another. Why do they at all quarrel with another? Because presumably they live together because of love for one another. Still, they quarrel with one another. Why? Because both of them, consciously and subconsciously, see their person, their own person, as more important than the person of who presumably is their beloved. That's just the plain truth about quarrels. And therefore, from time to time, these two people cannot get along. So even in a very, in a situation with just two people in it, you have this problem. Then you have, for example, two countries not getting along in terms of their relations with one another, diplomatic and otherwise. Then you have the example of different groups in terms of race, those of color, those of no color, those in between. I think in today's world people are referred to as brown, black and whatnot. It's very color oriented. The issue of categorizing people according to the race they belong to. The color seems to be a predominant mark in terms of defining those who do not look like yourself. And here again, well, we all know about racism and what it involves. And it's again just about seeing yourself as better, as superior, being the root of this kind of problem. So this is an imbalanced mindset. That's the point made with the contemplative, the name of this type of contemplative meditation, where you try to get to a balanced viewpoint. Not just a viewpoint in terms of how you feel with respect to people who have another color of their skin and so on and so forth. There is a whole, there is a wide range of sentiments and viewpoints regarding all of this that makes for an imbalanced world view. And it's a matter of correcting this. If you think of the Indian subcontinent and its caste system and all the problems, or rather imbalances at hand in that context, it may become, this issue may become more clear. And these sort of imbalances are not imbalances that happened a decade ago or so. They've been there for thousands of years if one looks at the Indian subcontinent in the context of the caste system. Now the highest in terms of the Indian caste system, the highest caste is the Brahmanical caste. Now within this caste you then have subgroups. So it's not as if you have a caste, end of story. No, you have this caste, and within it you have numerous sub-levels. So even within a single caste, there are problems or imbalances, as it were.
다 된대를 때네 부생계도 초도 저바래 부모생계도 멤버를 세야 그냥 가세지 중자.
And then if we think of the history of mankind and gender inequality, the inequality that still persists today between men and women, that kind of inequality.
Perna, tajemi bugu jeju yonkin ge kokpen na le yonkin de pomo yinna tu tatayan sei chakdo.
In many parts of the world, still today, the birth of a daughter is not desired at all. And with today's technical equipment, one can find that out before birth, whether the child in the womb of the future mother is a son or a daughter, and very often then if a daughter, she's aborted.
Tindeki semtel penna manyam be semtel samaji tangda kanje stupid reja. So kokbenali eva pugu de ngarang pugro.
Think of this when one talks about an imbalanced state here. It borders on, I would say, a mental disorder, because whether the child in the womb of the future mother is a son or a daughter, it's still your child. You, the one who decides to abort the child, it's your child. There should, one would think, be some sentiments of love for my own unborn child, but that seems to be lacking. So one can truly talk about an imbalanced mindset here, because the natural love a parent, one would think, has for his child, whether yet born or not, simply seems to be absent.
Perna, ngarang nzugutela triji jam cheshana, tanghe pe nzugu chesong sina urka sejek. Pasho pugutela maintain segi oro.
Now,
parcho pugute zugte nye jamaro.
If you, while making your evening dinner, while chopping the vegetables, you cut yourself badly in a finger by accident, there is a lot of upset. You might even say to whomever is there, I think I need to go to the emergency room and have it looked at, because maybe it needs to be stitched. And everyone there is sort of embroiled in this problem of one person in the household having cut his finger while chopping vegetables. Then think about the decision of aborting your own child. Who is upset there? It seems that none of the concerned are very upset at all. It's just a matter of removing, and remember, your own flesh and blood, because it's your child. But that sentiment doesn't seem to be there, so perhaps not always, but it seems that there is less upset in connection with an abortion than in connection with a bad cut in your finger from time to time. So one can truly speak about an imbalanced mindset here.
Daga nanshinge ta nomba deso de chashana miri kana nyota kasechido. Tenzo kanga ya nyambe sem senge mevar den shongorwa.
And then there is this, in today's world, racist issue, in particular between black and white. And when will it end, one wonders sometimes. It simply seems to continue, and this issue is very much alive in so-called developed and civilized societies. Though if one gives thought to the issue, it should become clear that it's not civilized at all to regard a group of people who have another skin color than your own as inferior for that reason, for the reason of having another color of your skin. It's very imbalanced, that worldview or that mindset.
Penna kado karbo yinayendra, nakbo yinayendra, kado chibrawa.
Whether black or white, it's simply a matter of a color.
Tene tagana shenge ngazo kado karbo yinayendra, servo yinayendra, ta Asia gmirigla kado servo segidawa. Te kare yinayang dongbon jongsa de nakbora.
And then you have the sort of in-between. I think in today's world referred to as a brown, which includes Asians and other races. In the end, if one relies for information regarding various races in the human world, if one relies on today's science, which is very often the norm in today's world, science explained that all races originated from the African continent. So the different skin colors appear to have developed after migration from the African continent happened. I have no idea of, and I have not studied the topic of the reasons for that, but there are probably reasons for why skin color and so on changed later on. However, we're all descendants of the African tribe, as it were. So what's the big deal in the end here? Today, we on the European continent, for example, here, do not have a black skin color. However, we are the descendants of those with a black skin color. So we're all related, as it were. We are relations as members of the human tribe.
Penata African shongare sayate that Trikazang shesochi watching ribaki.
At least according to science.
Tate sansle yicheche tella japsun ro kanga jengim mirigayang tadong mirikana gnyongshati chene tegido.
So in the modern world, particularly in the so-called developed part of it, people more or less see science as more believable than religion to a great extent, both on the European continent and on the North American continent and so on and so forth. So one could say that people sort of take refuge in the ideas of science. That's a choice. They have the right to make that choice. However, people on at least these two continents, in particular the US, it seems, in spite of very often taking refuge in the view of, in the views and the findings of science, persist in their racist ideas about different groups of the populations on those continents. And one can only remind everyone of that we all, according to science, which is very important on at least these continents, we all came from the African continent, so what is the problem?
So the
contemplative meditation here is about, to begin with, consider these imbalances in order to realize that probably oneself, to one degree or another, one's own mindset is an imbalanced mindset.
The Jaselani no Sonntag, Dungal Yusete, Sebra Malu City. Yusete, Nat Pemandrawachi, Samben Zintang Tilat in the Legidua, so much.
That's why Togme Zangpo here points out that all suffering comes from wanting happiness for oneself alone. And perfect Buddhas, the opposite in terms of mindset here, they are born from wanting happiness for others, benefit for others. Furthermore, the Indian Buddhist master of old Shantideva said in his engaging in the deeds of a Bodhisattva, in this world, Shantideva said, harm that's encountered, suffering that's experienced, various fears in the mind, all of it originate with an imbalanced mindset, where various perspectives of imbalance and inequality in the context of I and other are at hand. It's because of these imbalances that one encounters harm. It's because of these imbalances that one finds oneself in circumstances of suffering. And it's because of these imbalances that fear, in terms of the various types that there are, happen. Khenpo Rinpoche says it's not just in the so-called developed part of the world that this happens, it's everywhere. He takes his own people as an example, the Tibetan people, where people of color are referred to as black. Even the idea of naming others because of their skin color points to an imbalanced mindset, one which consciously or subconsciously, view others as inferior for various reasons. Here, because of the color of the skin.
Tene nge kundon shui silomena nagrin gadebden don jega shoku segndo shui ka songmen do shoche songdo te konzon jega nang sade konzon man ro sa da ya sho songdo ya kundo jariende 이진 응행 고게들 직전 탁생 직전 거기 축계제도 직시어졌어 강슈이네 강이 뭐야 하고 마서 강슈인 대타임은 나보던 자들 최치세선 것입니다. 나그리 슈인제 콘전 나글레 kökal레 간데시에게 요송다. 저는 지야에 가마를 버버트라다 띄우네 된 송화에서 찌죽송도 말에 저런 게 매일 띄우 보고 다 거지랬어. 대직 원에 깔합지 나선데 니마 망버리 뒤턴다 깔름 나서. 상당도 원에 담아 초래도.
나 릴세나 릴데.
리디 지금 나도도 루지야로 접단데서 다그도서.
Let me think.
다동
카당나 챔프인 파송되지.
야, 지금 야, 맞대되지 여러 되게 다 맹에 다셔를 간다.
Well, in terms of the Tibetan language, it's not just a matter of the color of the skin in terms of the name given to Africans. It's also about the features of the face, having a prominent nose, prominent lips, and the like. Now, in 73, Khenpo Rinpoche tells us, when he was living in Rumtek Monastery in the northern Sikkim state of India, where the late Karmapa had built his seat in exile, and where he studied and practiced meditation under the guidance of the late Karmapa. In 73, a group of black people from Kenya, a group of Kenyans came and asked to meet with His Holiness. They sought an audience with him. And so they had approached Khenpo Rinpoche, who, in response, went to the quarters of the Karmapa, the 16th Karmapa, and told him that there are some of those black people with those prominent features type of thing. The way Tibetans in general in those days referred to people from the African continent or of African descent, who want to see you. And His Holiness had said, well, bring them in then. And there had been the audience, and the visitors left. And once they had left, His Holiness called Khenpo Rinpoche and said, what did you say when you told me about the Kenyans wanting an audience with me? Well, I don't know what are you referring to, Khenpo had answered. What name did you use for them? Did you call them Kenyans, or what did you call them? No, it was those black people with the prominent features, Khenpo had said. And once he had pronounced that phrase, His Holiness hit him very hard over his head and said, what's, what's the difference between them and you? Why do you speak of yourself as a person of a pale complexion and less prominent features than them? What's your reason for this? His Holiness had asked him. In fact, according to the legends of Tibet, His Holiness had said, Tibetans are the descendants of apes. So, should I then refer to you as an ape person? How would you feel? And so on and so forth. And apparently His Holiness had gone on about this for days on end, making quite clear that referring to someone as a black person with prominent facial features is not okay. It simply points to imbalances in your mindset, and you need to correct this.
Oh yeah, teacher do penna jiktin din on a nyokray sete dagim manyam besem de la ten yong de doa.
And in the end, what should be clear to some extent right now is that these sort of imbalanced worldviews are inappropriate and the source of all problems in the world. Next, the author goes on to point out, as was explained earlier, that on the other hand, perfect Buddhas are born from wanting to benefit others. So, in terms of highly accomplished individuals, so-called Buddhas, there the opposite holds true, namely that their mindsets are free of the imbalances we've been talking about earlier.
So,
in terms of beginning this path of a Bodhisattva, to begin with, one does this kind of contemplative meditation till one can see a difference as to one's mindset and how one views others. That the previous imbalances at least have been remedied to some point. Then one can start with contemplative meditation number 2, which is about exchanging one's own happiness for the suffering of others. And here the author says, thus, truly exchanging your own happiness for the suffering of others is the practice of a Bodhisattva.
tene shambe tsawa chenje rangi dewa tang gewa yinla tende shamba tsemel
det är god eller chik am chokoma som kan det sig som
rangi dewa tang gewa kan yobate semjin yinla treparande samno di samna te shamba tsemel tene yongo gyarwa shambe semel tene.
Now here in terms of exchanging one's own happiness for the suffering of others, one begins as follows. One begins by viewing one's own mindset in terms of good states, states of happiness, states of virtuous inclination and the like. And one looks at one's own happiness, constructive states of mind and so on, in the light of wanting to give the good one has to others. Of course, here this is a mental training. It's not as if you at this point would be able to sort of give your happiness concretely to someone else or to others. It's a matter of training in thinking in this way. And this kind of training is, or this type of, or perspective of contemplative meditation is referred to as training in loving kindness for others. So it's about training oneself in terms of removing or eradicating selfish motives, rather than wanting to keep happiness and the like for oneself. One trains oneself to the extent where, if one could, one would like to give that to others and take upon oneself their suffering in order to save them from suffering.
Tene yeju dungal tenzo rangi tsuru linyete di mikpande nije chimbu tsawa chenji mikpachi goguyo bashe.
And in terms of taking upon oneself the suffering of others, that relates to one's level of capacity in terms of compassion for others. The kind of compassion where one can't bear seeing others suffer. One would prefer to take upon oneself their suffering. One would prefer to see them happy.
Di lojong grambande tene kadambe lojong gramba ndra menda nang yore penna dendembe nang la rangi tapsie dawote rang uk tone na mikpate ne gamsu chi songrwa.
Now this kind of contemplative meditation is known within the context of so-called mind training, and the Kadampa tradition emphasizes this kind of training very much, and is a principal tradition in terms of so-called mind training. And within mind training, you find hundreds of different methods. There is one group that lists 7 methods, known as the 7 points of mind training. But keep in mind that there are hundreds and hundreds of more trainings or methods within mind training. These 7 are not the only ones. However, within the context of the 7 points of mind training, the contemplative meditation described in brief here, where one wants to exchange one's own happiness for the suffering of others, that is done, or one method here is the following, namely, one conjoins that mindset with the coming and going of one's breath. So when breathing out, one meditates or imagines simply, in terms of a beginner practitioner, that one gives one's happiness to others. And when breathing in, that one takes upon oneself their suffering, in order just to train the mindset so it becomes more natural for one to think in terms of the good of others being more important than one's personal good or happiness.
단디 nenga rabote tan lojong tenden mage ta chikande ngazo ka yu shone shibuji nangyo.
Now, in the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism, the 7 points of mind training is emphasized a lot.
Di nenga rabo kala tu dendo sida ukpa tang chungwe te mare nenga rabo te tangpo takin nam besem de la kamjuk.
Now, the main point here isn't the process of breathing in and out. The process of breathing is not at all the object of meditation. It's like a tool that you have and you can use, which may help you to focus on the actual object of meditation, which is to achieve a change in your mindset where your own happiness isn't emphasized. It is rather the happiness of others that's emphasized. That is the meditation. The process of breathing is something which helps you to maintain that focus. And it's something we do constantly, therefore readily available. So one has to keep that in mind, and in the context of any meditation method, whether contemplative or otherwise, one needs to really understand what the actual object of meditation is. Then, in addition, you have other components, as it were, of the meditation that help you focus on the object of meditation. And one has to be clear as to how one understands the meditation, which factor is doing what, and what the actual object of the meditation is. And here, as was said, in this context, it is to achieve a change in your mindset which counteracts selfishness.
Penna dagin nyam besem de mena. Dene dagin geve sem se kende yongya kala khabt.
And as was said earlier,
yong tugmare.
In the absence of a balanced mindset where the welfare of myself and the welfare of others are equally important, it's not possible for anyone to do very much for others, to exchange your own happiness for the suffering of others. with an imbalanced mindset, that's simply not possible.
Delangar kaye keje tengkinya sung. Penna tongning de gamdu mi ying nasang ngarang goyong marves.
Now, there have been practitioners who ask different questions regarding the ins and outs of this kind of contemplative meditation in terms of this topic. They have voiced fears such as, well, if I meditate, if I imagine in my meditation that I take upon myself the disease of someone else, is it a possibility that I may develop that disease? Fears like that have been voiced. Well, one then has to, if that happens, ask oneself, why do I think like this? And if one looks at it, or one's own reaction to this kind of contemplative meditation, this reaction of fear, it originates with an imbalanced mindset, a mindset which is concerned with one's own welfare to a degree that's much higher than one's concern for the welfare of others. It is rather taught or explained that a balanced mindset, free of fears of this type, would, in consequence of meditating, that one takes upon oneself the disease or diseases of others, that kind of meditation would rather pacify the possibility of the practitioner falling ill altogether, simply because this is a balanced mindset of virtue focused on eradicating selfish motives, and the impact of that virtue is such that disease would be eradicated rather than developed.
Background rabote di minga de songke joan ma gyubere yitol tikka be yosamare di minga sartun ankinte chekawa yishidorje shungindere sa chekawa yishidorje
chekawa
yishidorje shungi kongre kong kare chenen namand sartun zai yorsana
kong yiktola kore
kong zawa de yitol ko na di damngan de thoma kong ta longba ti na yoksa de lan se huji na ge yor kap turap ti na la pelen ze le na shigyu ta jue ne ze hu den so longba ji na lu sha ge yor kala sa ye de ya che zang kong de pep ne ta da yin yam be sem tan da yin ye sem de gam ju de ba den ze hu den so den ze hu den so kan ga cha su ma che na sa Til den
da shen yam pe sem tan
da yin je sem den mandela kap te du den ma se tanye koran yo ma ren je shu se kre je hu chu lu se kre
Now, the 7 points of mind training, in Tibet originate with Atisha, that Indian Buddhist master who lived and worked in Tibet for many, many years. However, during his time, there were no written manuscripts of these teachings. People were given the teachings or explanations and committed them to memory. Later on, the root text, known as the 7 points of mind training, was written down by a later Tibetan Buddhist master by the name Chödrak. Now, this master, at one point in life, traveled to an area inhabited by individuals who had contracted leprosy. Now, in those days, there was no cure for leprosy. And in order to contain the spread of leprosy, people infected with this disease were not allowed to live in society at large, but had to move to an area that had been designated for them. There they lived and they were fed by the rest of the population till they died. Now, Chödrak apparently traveled there, and he there committed himself to this kind of, or to the contemplative meditation in 2 points just described. Point number 1, which is about various methods by way of which an imbalanced, meaning a selfish mindset is remedied. And then point number 2, contemplative meditation where the practitioner exchanges his own happiness for the suffering of others. Apparently, Chödrak perfected those meditations to the point where the individuals who at this time lived in this leprosy colony were cured of the disease. And in those days, therefore, this method became known as the method by way of which one cures leprosy. So it was the leprosy antidote of the day, as it were.
Ta tinte sene dagjin nyambe semta dagjin geve semda junsin tenzo semle chene yangne yang de gamna da ting tu le ngepa chim nong be sare nyamlempa chedu.
So it seems that in terms of training in these 2 points as to this kind of contemplative meditation, the practitioner mentally goes through the different perspectives in terms of an imbalanced mindset and in terms of a balanced mindset, until the point where it becomes rather crystal clear to the practitioner what these 2 mindsets are about.
Tene chi gam te lo chi kam yong yin ting mo ne nge sem de jo wa chim ro gu sa
to the point where the practitioner's mindset, as it were, in effect of these efforts, makes a shift and thus selfish motives and the like, and all the imbalances originating with selfish motives are eradicated simply. Tene?
Tene teji kamyona tengosulalin tartubaji yungche.
To the point where the mindset of a bodhisattva is born, an accomplished bodhisattva. And once this has been realized, it appears that the now accomplished or realized bodhisattva, through his efforts, can remedy disease and other misfortunes. I should say, by the power of this mindset, he's able to remedy disease and other misfortunes. And holy men of this level, as it were, do not appear to have any difficulties in performing deeds like this. The deed of pacifying disease such as leprosy and the like. Khenpo Rinpoche explains that when the late Karmapa, who primarily lived at Rinpoche monastery in the Himalayan foothills of the Sikkim state of northern India, he was available from very early in the morning to very late at night for people, and there would be an seeking his audience, and there would be a steady stream of people who would come to him with various problems and for instructions as to practicing the Buddhist path and so on and so forth. But Khenpo Rinpoche says one never saw His Holiness tire of this, or there were never any signs of him feeling exhausted in spite of this constant stream of people every single day. Khenpo Rinpoche gives another example of a recent Tibetan Buddhist master, the late Dingo Chensa Rinpoche, who would be also available every day from 10 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock at night, and people would very often come because they had problems they needed help with solving, or they needed instructions, reading, transmissions, empowerments, and so on. And the late Dingo Chensa Rinpoche always responded in the positive, would never deny a request. And there as well, Khenpo Rinpoche says, he never saw any signs of exhaustion or tiring of the endless stream of people coming. And it appears that this would originate with having actualized the body mind. Then feeling tired, exhausted, and so on in terms of helping others. Simply doesn't happen. It's the power of the body mind, or the nature of the body mind, that makes for this, apparently. So that's all for today.
Sunamdeya damje zegbanye tamne nyeke dranam pamche te che gana che bala truwa sibe solen drowa dolwar sho.